My name is Hannah Dyson from Enfield Voices and Global Net 21, and this is one of the regular webinars we do telling people's stories, inspiring, learning and gaining knowledge of the experience of others. Tonight's webinar is called A Journey of Identity, a story of my dual heritage and the importance of open dialogue about mixed ethnicity. In this webinar, we discuss a journey which starts in a farm in rural Philippines and takes us to Manila, the Philippines, Cornwall, the UK, Nottingham and North London. A chance meeting at a hotel in Manila leads to a magical love story, adventure, opportunity, hopes, dreams and a new family. This evening, we're delighted to be chatting to Christian MacNamara, who will be telling his stories of growing up in various towns and cities in the UK and the challenges this entailed whilst trying to fit in. Christian has a mixed ethnic heritage with roots in the Philippines as well as in the UK. He's always been aware of the difference his dual heritage gave him growing up in largely white communities. And since the events of summer 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement, has gained an appreciation of the importance of speaking more openly about the mixed race experience. So welcome, Christian, to the webinar this evening.
Thank you, Hannah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, just a brief introduction?
Well, the introduction you gave me just now was very flattering, so thank you. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I've grown up in quite a few different places across the UK, actually mostly kind of small towns and villages, and I think that's really kind of played a big part in forming my personality and also my identity, which obviously we're going to talk about mostly this evening. I live in London at the moment. I've been here for about 10 years. I've been working in homelessness for the last few years, and that's really my main passion about ending homelessness in London in particular. The last year has been really difficult for all of us for so many reasons. I'm really glad and really grateful for being able to work on something that really gives me meaning in terms of supporting rough sleepers during the pandemic. As you very kindly and eloquently described in the blurb for this webinar, we've been working on what's now seen as a global leading response to supporting rough sleepers during the pandemic. We made sure that the number of infections to rough sleepers was absolutely minimized over the capital in the last year, and we're still looking after those individuals who came in during the government's Everyone In programme, and hopefully we'll continue to do so. So that's really given me something to get my teeth into and allowed me to kind of express one of my sort of main passions through my work. At the moment, I am living with my partner, working from home with our cat, and we've got a daughter due, our first in May. So really excited about that. And my mum, who I guess we'll talk a bit about tonight as well, who is Filipino, as you mentioned. She's currently in the UK, which is quite unusual for me. She's spent most of the last 10 years in the Philippines. So the fact that she's here and we've got her granddaughter on the way, I think is really, really important for me. So looking forward to that very much.
Yeah, it's an amazingly exciting time for you, Christian. And you've really come a long way. I think we obviously met at work, and you know, we've kept in touch here and there since that time. And yeah, could you tell us a little bit about your family's story of your parents at meeting in Manila, the Philippines, and then like settling in Cornwall?
Yeah, so my mum's, I suppose, from what you'd call a very traditional Filipino family, and it's a story that anyone who's met someone like me who might have Filipino parent or parents may have heard before. Comes from a family of subsistence farmers, so rice farming, from an island called Leyte, which is in the eastern Visayas, sort of in the central Philippines. She was part of a very large family, the eldest daughter, with lots of siblings. It was quite challenging for her growing up in terms of the demands on her as the eldest child, I think, because her parents were working. very hard on the farm. It kind of fell to her to look after her family, so she became sort of an appointed matriarch of the house from a very young age. She ended up leaving school before the end of primary school, what the equivalent would be over here, in order to do that. So the fact that she even ended up meeting my dad, I think, is just so unlikely. Someone who comes from that background to have ended up where she is now. I think it took a lot of hard work from her end, but also a lot of chance, I suppose, as well. So when she got a little bit older, old enough to leave the family village, she managed to convince her parents to let her to go to Manila, which, you know, even now it's perhaps not seen as the safest city in the world. Anyone who's been there might know what I'm talking about. It's a hard city, I suppose, like London is in many ways, to make a living in. And I think they were really reluctant to let her go from her very quiet life down in the village. But she managed to convince them. And yeah, it was a chance encounter, really, in a hotel. My dad was working as he was working for a large travel agency at the time. So he spent a lot of time in Australia and in Southeast Asia, building tour packages and meeting with clients and all that kind of corporate-y stuff that I never really fully understood. And yeah, it was one of those where he like spotted her across the room. I mean, I don't know how much of this is true, but you know, the way parents like to spin their romantic meeting stories. Yeah, and he managed to get a conversation with her, which I think was impressive at the time because she barely spoke any English, having not finished primary school and being from a very rural family. But you know, they had this kind of blossoming relationship over there, and he would come back to the UK, and then he'd go and visit her whenever he could, or get an excuse to go there for work, I suppose, probably more likely. And yeah. I think he was quite a bit older than my dad and very traditional, so he really did the thing of like going down to meet the family and following all the, I suppose, the local traditions around courting someone. It was a bit old-fashioned in that sense, but yeah, they moved to the UK quite quickly after getting married.
They went to Cornwall first, or was it Nottingham?
Yeah, it was Cornwall. So yeah, my dad had a cousin down there, and I think he felt like maybe it would be a nice introduction to British life. You know, Cornwall's very, it's lovely. I still love going there now. It's such a nice place. But you know, very close-knit communities, very warm people, I think, generally speaking. Maybe that's a bit of a generalization, but certainly been my experience. And you know, having some family there as well, I think it really helped Mum sort of establish herself in the UK. I think for me, growing up there, it was quiet, and it was, I suppose, a community that had grown very organically and sort of was rather insular in that respect as well. And I think it's something I noticed in lots of the places we ended up living, was that, you know, my mum was one of maybe like 2 or 3 Filipino people in the whole of the, you know, town that we lived in. And I think there was a feeling of difference probably quite early on in my childhood, growing up there, even though I didn't know it at the time. I think reflecting on it now, reflecting on my experiences now, I think it's really clear sort of how unusual we were as this family of sort of little half Filipino children in a very quiet white town in Cornwall.
Because I guess as a child, you don't really, you know, there's something different, but you don't, you can't really verbalize it, I guess, in that way. And sometimes parents might not talk about it openly. It depends on, I guess, who your parents are. So yeah, what were the challenges of growing up in Cornwall at that time? And did your parents have any sort of conversations with you about being a sort of mixed heritage at all? Or...
No, and I don't like to talk ill of anyone in their absence, but they absolutely didn't talk to us about that stuff at all. I think it was something that was sort of deliberately ignored. And I think this, you know, when we were talking about this before, it really kind of struck me, I suppose, how much my upbringing reflected what my parents' aspirations were, whether or not that's what I wanted for myself and what I would choose for myself now. It certainly isn't what I would choose for myself now. And I think that was an aspiration of whiteness and Britishness. I think my dad, as I mentioned, he was very, very traditional. He was a bit older than my mum. So he grew up in the 50s and 60s. And I think his upbringing, was very traditional and was very kind of based around traditional British values. A lot of that stuff is positive. It's based around sort of politeness and pride, manners, and a certain way of speaking, and all that stuff is great to an extent. But I think actually there was a real feeling that we needed to minimize our Filipino side of our heritage and of our personalities and of our how we presented outwardly, in order to fit in order to be more British and be more accepted in the sort of relatively small communities that we were growing up in. It was the same when I moved to Northamptonshire, and when we were in Dorset as well. These are really small villages where there were predominantly, if not completely white. And I think when you have a peer group that doesn't look like you, there is a need to minimize as much as possible that feeling of otherness in order to feel accepted. And I would say that my parents, they didn't discourage it, I suppose is probably a kind way of putting it. I think they felt like if that's what would make us happy and get us friends and help us feel like we were part of the community, they were fine with that. And I think really for my mum as well, I think she felt really insecure about how she appeared and how she spoke, around people who didn't have an accent like her, and they were British, and I think she really wanted to be like them. And I sympathize with that so much, being an outsider and wanting to fit in. And I think it's only really in recent years where I've realized how much I've lost out from rejecting my Filipino heritage at such a young age. And I've tried very much in the last few years to embrace it more and more, and to wear it openly and proudly, and define myself as someone who is mixed race and Filipino, because it has so much going for it, my heritage, and I think it's worth celebrating and not being embarrassed about or shy about.
It's definitely worth being really, really proud of your heritage. I definitely believe that really passionately. And to help you get to where you are now, so you feel completely at peace, sort of like really proud of your heritage. I think you went on literally a journey to get to that place, and there was 2 trips that you went on to the Philippines to go and see your family there, and that was 2016 and 2018. And could you tell us a bit about those trips, and did you take your partner Ceri with you on both trips or one?
Yeah, so on the first trip in 2016, that was actually kind of forced. It'd been a long time since I'd been to the Philippines. Before then, it had been, I think, about 7 years. And it was actually because of a death in the family. And my mum was going, and I wanted to go with her for support. My sister ended up joining us as well. That was a difficult experience, because anyone from Filipino background who's been to a Filipino funeral will know that they're really intense experiences. There's waking vigil between and the body's laid in state in the family home, and there's a funeral procession which everyone takes part in, and there's it's really cathartic. I think that's kind of its main purpose, is that you get to express all your full feelings. But being British, as I felt, as I've been brought up, going over there where funerals possibly are not particularly expressive, and I know there's lots of reasons why that's not great, but I think it was a real eye-opener for me to the difference, certain big life events like funerals and weddings, Filipino weddings I've been to as well, huge differences in the way that our cultures approach those, but I only have understanding of one of them. And I think that trip in 2016, showing that, where I saw the unity of my family, and me being embraced as someone who was mourning, into, that community, I think I felt really, really touched by that, and also really piqued my curiosity about, well, what more is it that I want to learn about my Filipino heritage? What more could I gain from it, and how can I better serve and honor that? So I think the trip in 2018, I think I'd been talking to Ceri about going to the Philippines for years, but we'd never quite justified the time and the expense of going. But I'm really, really glad that we went. We got to spend a couple of weeks with my mum. She was still living there at the time. Her really kind of showing us the ropes, showing us around her family farm and visiting all my uncles and aunts in their houses. She's the only one, barring one other member of her generation, who left the village. They're all still there. Their families are all still there. So my first cousins and second cousins, they're all within a stone's throw of my grandmother's house, the house that my mum grew up in, or the plot where the house was where she grew up. So it's almost like you can step straight into my entire Filipino family in one go. And I thought that was an experience that, I really wanted Ceri to be a part of, and for her to, I suppose, see why I was really trying to, I suppose, maximize my exposure to my culture, my family's culture, and try to absorb that into more of who I am and how I express myself and how I define myself. And I think it really, really achieved that. We traveled around to a few different places as well. We went to Cebu, which is relatively popular tourist place, but my mum had a friend who owned a place with a swimming pool, so we could not go there. And then we went to Palawan, which is again a fairly popular tourist destination, but completely different sort of geographically, and some cultural differences to where my mum grew up. So again, really interesting just to see that, and to try and understand a bit about Filipino life in a way that I had actively avoided probably up until a certain point in my life. So yeah, it was fantastic, and I hope there'll be many more.
By that stage, by the time you went to the Philippines in 2016, you've been living in London for quite a few years, I think. I don't know how, maybe 4 or 5. So perhaps by living in London, you had met other people who were also on that journey, or who also had a mixed ethnic heritage, and perhaps that gave you the impetus to go on that journey of identity, do you think?
Yeah, I think I've met, over the years, some people who can talk really eloquently and knowledgeably about their cultural heritage, mixed race people. And, I have no idea what it's like to be mixed race and Black, or mixed race and Indian. Those are completely different experiences to mine, but there is something consistent across experiences of those who are mixed race. Something around, I suppose, an ambiguity, and also an element of choice in terms of how much you value and prioritize your non-British heritage. And actually, the people who I met tended to know a lot more about their families and their culture than I did. And I wouldn't say that I was embarrassed. I think it just kind of highlighted that to me, that there was something I was missing there. And you're right, in London, you come across people like that all the time, and it's perfectly normal. And I think that's great, and that's how it should be. It certainly wasn't. I didn't feel that way for my entire life. But, and I also feel like, lots of people I've met, they may have a name that kind of nods to their heritage, which I don't, or they may retain a surname that again nods to their heritage, which I don't either. So I think for me, and I'm also very, very conscious that I'm very light-skinned, and I have that privilege, I suppose, that it's been really easy for most of my life to hide my non-British identity. If I really wanted to, got a completely British name, and there are some people who, if I hadn't told them, they wouldn't have known that I had a non-British mother. So I think it's about not falling into that trap of feeling like I need to hide it, and actually taking the opposite steps to expose myself and have those conversations about, well, what does it mean to be mixed race, and what the various challenges that brings, but also like really good opportunities to identify those things. Someone who has an Indian mother, a friend of mine, talking about his life growing up. And actually, there are loads of parallels to the way we experience sort of culture shock and, not being sure about how to identify ourselves, but also like being really interested and like finding all the humor and like the family traditions that otherwise I would be missing out on. So
I think that's definitely a great sort of gift that you have if you are mixed ethnic heritage. You can find the humor in the traditions and the gatherings, like the weddings and things like that. I think that's a really great thing to be able to have. So do you think your partner Ceri sort of encouraged you, but maybe like your conversations together, so when you went on your trip in 2018, do you think she helped you have the confidence to discover your identity a bit further and embrace your family?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure if I have looked at it that way before, but I think her seeing it through her eyes, maybe is a better way of putting it, really kind of, it really helped me appreciate some of the things that maybe I took for granted or maybe I didn't find that interesting. Certainly going there as a kid, I think I felt quite, it's weird all the stuff I've talked about so far. I think I felt a bit embarrassed about my Britishness. So like kind of the opposite of when I was in the UK, that, I felt like really out of place. I was like, I didn't know anything about the Philippines going there as a kid. I couldn't speak any of the language. I didn't know how to behave, how to act, like what the cultural norms were, because I just hadn't been taught that stuff. And I wasn't interested in it, being Franco. As a kid, I didn't want to know. I was just interested in what my friends were doing and being like them. So whereas my mum could kind of flick it on and off like a switch, she could be one or the other depending on what the setting was. And obviously my dad was really well traveled, and he kind of loved and understood the Philippines, so was very comfortable being there. I think both my sister and I were really like lost and felt kind of like trapped in the middle. It's like, well, are we Filipino and can we talk to our Filipino family, or are we British and we're like tourists and we're different to them and they don't like us? And so in many ways, I think it was kind of an extreme version of what we felt in the UK, because we just, with the language barrier especially, I think that really held us back. So I think started to focus on the things that I did understand, and like the relatives that were especially friendly and wouldn't be embarrassed about trying to talk to us in English to make us feel welcome, and bless them for doing that. But seeing it through Ceri's eyes, her going over there and actually her being interested in things or finding humor or finding, I suppose, being curious about stuff that maybe I would ignore, or maybe it's just stuff that I've seen before and not that interested in. I think that really was a bit of an eye-opener, and it made me quite proud as well. I think I wasn't sure how she'd feel about it. And again, it comes back to this thing, and I definitely take a lot of responsibility for feeling or allowing myself to feel embarrassed or not proud of my Filipino heritage for a very long time. That perhaps I didn't expect her to be that impressed by the country. I was like, oh, I'll drag her along so that I can spend some time with my mum and hopefully she won't hate the food. Like that's about as much thought as I put into it. But it was like the opposite of that. She loved it, and she loved my family and, the weather and yes, the food, and like the way that people interacted, and the way that there were like so many of my cousins and children like always trying to be around and trying to be present when we were there for like the experience of being with us, because they wanted to be with us and near us, even if they couldn't communicate how much they enjoyed our company, like all that kind of stuff, which I think I'd glossed over or minimized or not paid attention to. I think having her there as that kind of third party to be like, this is great, you should really be proud of this, and your family are just lovely. I think that really helped kind of bring it home for me. So yeah, that is a very good point.
And do you think the summer of 2020, when the Black Lives Matter movement got a lot of publicity and people started going to events and started being protests, do you think that kind of made you be able to speak more openly about the mixed race experience?
I think it made me more confident being the person who could talk about issues of race. And I suppose what I mean by that is, like I said before, I don't know what the Black experience is. I can try and understand it, and I can read and learn, and I do, and I try my best to do that and to be an ally, but it will never be my experience. So I think rather than try to be part of Black Lives Matter, even though I'll openly support it and always will, I think what it highlighted to me was that as a mixed race person, I think I have a responsibility. And I'm lucky that I work in a place that's very racially inclusive, although it does acknowledge that it has more work to do. I currently am taking part in some training to become a facilitator for race-based discussions. So it's called Let's Talk About Race. And it's for any and all employees who are interested in learning more about issues of race, whether that be examples of discrimination, racism in the workplace, examples of microaggressions and microinclusions, ways to talk about it openly and non-judgmentally, I suppose, for people who want to learn more about how people who are non-white struggle in society. And I think 2 years ago, I wouldn't have put myself forward for that. I think I wouldn't have had the confidence. I would have felt like, oh no, that's for other people who are more comfortable with their identity, who have something to say, or who feel like they need to say something. And I think I felt like I didn't need to say anything. And I was benefiting from, lots of privileges. Like I said, British name, pale skin, well-spoken, from a nice family, middle class, all these privileges that lots of people whose struggles were highlighted through Black Lives Matter, through subsequent protests, people who have experienced challenges that I haven't, essentially. So I think it was quite a unique responsibility. I'm almost feel sometimes like a bit of a bridge. Like I can talk to my white friends about race in a way that they don't feel comfortable necessarily. They might not feel comfortable bringing it up. I mean, I don't want to make them uncomfortable, but I think it's important, and it's happened, naturally a lot more than perhaps I was expecting. And I think that's great. We talk about it in football quite a lot. Football's a really good talking point for issues of race, because it really focuses people in on something they care about, and allows conversations about different perspectives on the game and the experience of individuals, whether it's fans or footballers of colour in particular, and why that's an issue. So yeah, I think the events of 2020 were really transformative for how I view myself and how I view my responsibility in terms of talking about race, using my privilege, I suppose, that I have the opportunity and the confidence, and I'm lucky to be given the training to do that. And I think it helps in a way get me thinking more about my own heritage and reading more about my own heritage, so that I can answer questions about how I feel about it and why it's important to me, kind of like we're doing now, I guess.
I think that's really important in the workplace, because I think sometimes people can find it maybe quite awkward to bring those subjects up in the workplace. But if they can sort of speak to you maybe one-on-one or even in a group, that's really advantageous and gets the conversation going and continue the conversation. We're coming sort of towards the end of the webinar now, but I wanted to know if people want to sort of get in touch with you and ask you a bit more about your work, to do with sort of ethnicity or homelessness, and ask you a bit more about that, how can they get in contact to contact you?
Well, I'm always looking to speak to people in a professional capacity about homelessness and rough sleeping. I'm really fortunate to work for the Greater London Authority. So the Mayor has a large rough sleeping programme, which we're delivering at the moment, but there's constantly new pots of funding which are coming online, predominantly from central government. So we we deliver grants programs on behalf of central government. We also directly commission services through the mayor's budget. But we're interested in working with anyone who has an idea for the way that homelessness services can be developed. If it's a charity or someone's maybe a trustee and they're interested in learning more about what the GLA does and how they can become involved in services, then that's great. If it's people who want to provide kind of lived experience, insights into the experience of rough sleepers, people who have slept rough or been homeless before, people who are, again, trustees of charities that have members who are former rough sleepers. We're always interested in hearing from those people. So you can get me on LinkedIn. I will accept a message or a request or whatever. I'm not precious about that. Yeah, LinkedIn is the best place to find me.
Oh wow, well that's really, really helpful, and that's really interesting. I think there might be a few little local charities in Enfield that might be able to get in touch with you to ask your advice about homelessness. So I'll definitely direct them to you. Thanks, Christian, and thank you very much for sharing a little bit about your experiences in the journey of identity, and hopefully more people will be inspired by you and continue to be open about this conversation. And thank you, Christian, for being with us tonight and sharing that. And we'll end this webinar now.
Thank you.